All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to an evening with Bob Brown. My name is Sean Murray from Rising Tide, and I'm your MC for tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Warramai in a Awabakal country here in Newcastle. But no matter where we are on this continent, we're standing on unceded First Nations land. And I'd like to acknowledge any First Nations people here tonight and all elders past, present, and emerging. Please also feel free to acknowledge the country that you're on in the chat, and we can warm up the space a little bit. You can also use the chat if you have any comments or questions throughout the evening, and later on we'll also have some questions from the audience. So you can put your questions for Bob in the chat and we'll read out some at the end. So before I get started, there was some great news tonight. I want to give a huge shout out to the Move Beyond Coal campaign. So today they had news that NAB has been forced to cease funding Whitehaven Coal. So yeah, massive congratulations to everyone involved in that great victory. A bit of a virtual round of applause. Yep. Quick overview of the evening. Tonight's event is hosted by Rising Tide, as you've probably worked out. If you're unfamiliar with us, we're a grassroots climate justice movement based in Newcastle, but we've got some new groups starting to pop up around the country, and we're very excited to have heaps of people from across the whole country joining tonight. We've got a couple of watch parties happening here in Newcastle and Sydney as well. I think we can see them. Hear us, folks. Can we see you? Don't know. Anyway, it's great to have you. And so quickly about Rising Tide, we're campaigning to end coal ports from the world's largest coal port here in Newcastle. Did I say coal ports or coal exports? We're campaigning to end coal exports because the coal coming through here is contributing to 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is almost as much as Australia's entire domestic emissions. We'll talk about it more later on, but we're going to be inviting you to take our climate defence pledge to support a civil resistance campaign to end coal exports from Newcastle. Our plan is to get 10,000 plus people to pledge and then commence waves of civil resistance to disrupt the port and end coal exports by 2030. So tonight came about because in April, we hosted a climate camp, which I'm sure some of you would have made. But 300 people from across the country came together to do workshops, hear from great speakers and take action together. And the action involved stopping a coal train and occupying the tracks. 51 of us were arrested and we made global headlines, which was very exciting. And it also caught the eye of our guest tonight. So we thought it'd be great to be able to get some first-hand advice about what it takes to build a landmark environmental struggle to turn the tide of history from someone who knows. So the plan for tonight is about a 45-minute interview with Bob, then a quick invitation on how you can join our campaign, then about 15 minutes of Q&A, and then finally at the end, we're going to have a quick opportunity for those who wish to jump into some breakout rooms with people in your area so you can get involved in our upcoming speaking tour and also organising to come to the big port blockade that we're organising for November. So, folks, I'd now like to introduce our interviewer, Alexa Stuart. Alexa is 19 years old. She's a former Young Newcastle Citizen of the Year and, in my view, one of the strongest leaders to emerge from the school strike for climate movement. Alexa now works full-time at Rising Tide and she's already a formidable activist. So please welcome Alexa.
Thank you.
Yeah, and next, for many of us, Bob Brown, of course, needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, because for those who don't know him yet, Bob is one of Australia's greatest environmentalists. He's a humble hero who has reshaped the country for the better through his courage, tenacity and vision and decades of tireless work. From frontline battles to protect nature through to politics, Bob is an extraordinary leader who has long been a beacon to a better world. So please welcome Bob Brown.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks, Bob, for coming tonight. We are so excited to chat with you and get into it. So yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Alexa, and thank you, Sean, for that introduction. I'm here on Palawa country in Tasmania, close to the Huon River, on the other side of the river, the Lalaquani people, but very, very delighted to be mixed in with people who are taking action for the future of this planet, and everybody on it, and every species on it, every creature on it. So very happy and raring to go, Alexa.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to start tonight at, maybe the beginning at, I think it was in 1976 when you rafted down the Franklin River for the first time. Can you take us back to that journey? What was it like, and what impact did it have on you?
Well, I was a young doctor. I'd graduated from Sydney University a few years earlier and came to Tasmania to look for the Tasmanian tiger, which had gone, and to see Lake Pedder before it was flooded, in one of the most appalling environmental crimes in modern Tasmanian history. And then I got asked to go down the Franklin River because it was next to be dammed. And Paul Smith, the forester who wanted to go down, couldn't find anybody else silly enough to do it. So he asked me. And that fortnight in true wilderness, it's Aboriginal country, full of wildlife, platypuses, sea eagles, caverns, canyons, waterfalls, ancient little caves, was spellbinding. And for a doctor who was prescribing pills to help people get over their angst and their anxiety and their blood pressure and heart attacks and stomach ulcers and whatever it might be, all caused by the anxiety of modern materialist living, it seemed crazy to be at the end. They were building a dam. They were finding out where to anchor the dam, to spend a couple of $1 billion to make more electricity, to make more tranquilizers, when the very thing that we need, nature, was there in abundance. And so I got involved in that campaign. It took 7 years, but later that year, a few others who'd been down similar rivers that were tributaries of the Franklin, we got together, and a fellow called Kevin Kiernan, much younger than me, he'd been in the campaign to save the Lake Pedder, suggested the name of the Wilderness Society, and so it was the Tasmanian Wilderness Society back then, but we began campaigning from 16 people, greenies and beanies, in the middle of winter in the old house up at Liffey in central Tasmania, on a very cold end of June weekend, and it grew rapidly from there.
Yeah, so you mentioned Lake Pedder, which I think seems to me like had also such a big impact. That lake was just flooded a couple of years prior, and that magnificent place was lost forever. What impact do you think that had on you or the movement in general?
Well, it was the first nationally prominent environmental issue. It was across Four Corners, did a program on it in black and white and so on. But the interesting thing was talking with the people who'd been involved in it. They had thought about taking direct action, but didn't. And 10 years later, when the Franklin came down the line, it was always in our mind, at the back of our mind, that we might get to the point where we're losing too. And the last resort would be peaceful direct action. And that's exactly what happened. So the last 2 of those 7 years of the Franklin campaign, which involved huge organisational efforts and growth and output of literature and making of films and a whole pile of things, when push came to shove, we needed to take direct action. And for us, we knew we couldn't stop their bulldozers, but we knew one thing could, and that was public opinion. And the public, as with the pictures we've just seen of the wonderful people in the blue banners stopping the export of coal through stopping the trains, it stopped people, and they had to take notice, and they did, and they saw the beauty of the rivers behind the blockaders, because the media always wants human stories ahead of stories about the fate of the planet or other species or the well-being of future generations. But that got it going.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring that up. The idea of, like, I guess the blockade the sole purpose wasn't to physically stop the bulldozers, but it was really more about telling a story. And I think that story was what was so powerful. And can you go to the photo of the Franklin Dam that I'm sure many people will recognize? That's the one. And I think, this photo, maybe it kind of symbolizes a lot about how important that storytelling is, do you think?
It is. It's incredibly important, Alexa. And the thing about that photo is it's true. Peter Dombrovskis, who's not with us anymore, but he was the great, globally recognised as one of the great nature photographers of the end of last century, took that picture after I asked him to go down and see if he would take some pictures. And it's true because that scene was going to be completely obliterated, although it was 20 kilometres upriver, by the building of the dam where the Franklin and Gordon rivers got together. And there was nothing the Hydroelectric Commission could do to find fault with it, except when we did fly over it. And I had the Hydroelectric Commissioner sitting next to me and the leader of the opposition asleep in the helicopter in another seat. He pointed down and said, "Look, it's not beautiful like in the pictures. It's not beautiful." To me, it was a stunning scene. And it brought home again this idea that, to a degree, you must always talk to your opponents and you must always put forward your point of view to those who you want us, in this case, to the coal mining and the mining industry and the politicians behind it that we want to see bring a halt. But don't think you're going to change their mind. It's much more important to galvanise the mind of the public in a democracy where it's empowered at least by a vote, which is a much bigger worry. They can, they can pat you on the head and say, "Oh yes, that's a lovely scene, but there's others like it, and who goes there? And you're elitist because there isn't a highway in for people to take pictures." The whole range of arguments they'll come up with. But the important thing is that picture spoke to people in a way that words just didn't, and certainly had a pivotal role in saving the Franklin.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, it's just such an iconic photo. Like it's in houses all across Australia. My uncle has one hanging in his room, and it just has that enduring beauty. And I guess to me, when I see it, I think like, this is what happens when we come together and when we fight, and that we can win.
Yes, and it was at the cutting edge of technology back then. Remember, this is now over 40 years ago. And when it came to the election in 1983, the start of 1983, where Labor won office from the coalition and stopped the dam, we put that picture in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age and the Courier Mail, full page and colour. Now, the newspapers were black and white back then. So was all the advertising. So we put a specific sheet in there. This was right at the forefront of the technology, in colour. And I had Labor politicians telling me 20 years later it was still the best ad they'd ever seen, saying, "Would you vote for a party which would destroy this? Don't vote Liberal, vote Labor and or Democrats." So that's why, even though I don't understand it, I appreciate how important social media and new forms of media are in being used, not just by the corporations who've got access and the money for technology, but by community campaigners going out there on a limb, doing something different.
It's can be so powerful. And I just wanted to go back a little bit to when you first started to getting involved in the campaign. So as you mentioned, you were working as a doctor and then decided to quit that to work full-time. And I can really relate to that because today's actually my first day as a full-time worker at Rising Tide. I've just left my job at the bookshop and have turned down a couple of uni offers because this is what's most important to me. I'm wondering if you could, tell us a bit about that decision. Like, did you just know that it was the right one for you, or how did you make that choice?
Yeah, look, I relate so strongly. What a great decision you've made there, Alexa, and thank you for doing that. I relate so strongly to that. I went back and sat in my, I was working for a doctor's practice in Launceston, and said, I'll keep giving money to this new Wilderness Society. But a couple of years later, the volunteers had burnt out. There was nobody around. And so I went down to Hobart and became secretary for a while, and then stayed on and stayed on and stayed on. And I felt good about it. I had, the whole range of dumpsters were a very good source of tucker right back then. Yeah. And I had no income as such. Yeah. But it felt good, and it was good. We had a very fast-moving, fast-growing organisation of very young people, and we looked after each other. There was always somebody having a bit of a hard time. It was necessary to go and take time out to help look after them, and always people with new ideas. The general thing is, you've got a good idea, well, implement it. Don't distract the people who are really working towards a very fine strategy. But it was exciting. We had rental premises. We got kicked out of a couple of those, and then finally ended up, through taking around the purse, getting a group of people to buy the Wilderness Society, which still exists in Davey Street in Hobart. And having secure premises, of course, was really, really important. And I know that is even more important now with the pressures that are brought on to activist organisations who are setting out to save the planet, but on the way, riling the plutocrats, the wealthy people whose aim in life is simply to make more money.
Yeah. Totally. So one of the other things that is amazing to me about the Franklin campaign is, the pinning, like the moment of that blockade, and it lasted for like months. I just can't really imagine what it's like. Can you share some of your memories of that time at the blockade, of like what the atmosphere was like? What was it like?
Yes, sure, Alexa. Unlike that picture, it rained and rained and rained and rained.
Classic Tasmania.
Yes, but this was particularly, it was one of the wettest summers there've been in decades. In amongst that group is the blockaders from Terania Creek up near Nimbin, and the Nightcap Action Group, NAGS, who came down in a busload and brought with, they'd been blockading in the forests and had won effectively. And we were very lucky because they came down and were able to immediately implement the infrastructure. That scene, there's 40 kilometres from where you set off by boat to go to the camp, across Macquarie Harbour and up the river. So we needed infrastructure. We had a big base camp back in Strawn, the town of Strawn. We had to have secure camping area. We were kicked out of the public camping area by a council, Fiat, very shortly. And we found people who gave, it was called Greeny Acres, and a couple of acres out of town. But organising the tent spaces, the welcome, the training of people in NBA folk, having meals, of course, rostering on everything that's about the domestic well-being of a camp that's turning over hundreds of people, digging the latrines at the time. There were no toilets there, and making sure that people's health was looked after was incredibly important. So, in fact, Norm Sanders, who was a Democrat environmentalist in Tasmania, he later resigned over the mistreatment of women in being transported back to Hobart, and I took his seat in the Parliament. But he said that his job digging the ditches for the toilets there was in some ways more fulfilling than being back in the Parliament, where they were busy passing laws to build the dams. And you know, good spirit, lots of music, lots of artworks, lots of banner making, and critical to all this is keeping people informed on what's going on, passing on the information and being transparent and open about that. That was very, very important to us. We were out of range there. Dick Smith did come along with his helicopter and put a mast up on a mountain, and we did get radio range. We didn't, of course, have mobile phones or any of the modern appurtenances like that back then, but we still did manage to get, by the time the blockade started, did manage to be able to get radio communication with this camp upriver so that we could get news out and so on. And what was very important to that, critical, was getting the media there. So we had people who, we got shark cat boats, people who, it was their off season from fishing. We weren't necessarily in favour of what we were doing, but we were paying them for their craft. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, we had to get people to go to the motels, get whichever journalists were about out of bed, get them into these craft and get them upriver so that they could be brought back with their news footage and their camera footage, so that could be then got to the TV stations. They had to be back by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had to work to the media cycle on this very remote place to ensure we did break into the news each day as the blockade developed.
Yeah, well, I can just imagine all of how much more difficult it was being at such a remote place, and yeah, it's amazing. So what do you think the role of, you know, civil disobedience in this? I guess we've kind of already touched on it a little bit, but specifically, you know, the blockade, why did you end up deciding on that tactic?
Because it was all that was left. And Lake Pedder, they decided that if they involved themselves sitting in front of the bulldozers, they'd lose public opinion. Very conservative country we're talking about now, back in the 1960s and 70s. But we flew in a couple of Quakers from New Zealand who were experienced in some blockades they had against the hydro scheme over there. And we hired a bush camp and we trained people. People didn't like it, the idea of sitting in affinity groups and so on, but we persisted with it.
Yeah.
And then that spread. We had little groups all over the mainland, from Perth to Darwin to Canberra to Queanbeyan to, you know, Bendigo, places all over there where people had their training and spent a weekend, because you couldn't come and go into the blockade unless you'd been through training. Except if you came to the blockade, you had to spend 2 days doing training before you could go to the blockade, because we knew that if we got violent up there, and the authorities had much better communications than we did, it would be all up. They would play it up. And in fact, while I was in jail, arrested after being in the blockade, I was brought out of jail to the Central Police Station in Hobart, where a superintendent of police said, "We know there's going to be violence up there. We want you to go out as director of the Wilderness Society and call the blockade off before somebody's killed." And I said to him, "Well, Superintendent, if you know that there's violence going to occur, it is your job to stop it. I don't know anything about it. That's your job. You stop it. Don't call on me to call off the blockade, because I won't." So I got taken back to Risdon Prison. But you know, you have to be, and there was talk of it. You know, I did pick up talk of people saying, "Oh, this direct action's no good. We need to be taking it into our own hands much more directly." That's always in the background. And let me just interpolate here to say this, that if violence does occur in environmental protesting in Australia in the future, I'm going to blame every Labor, Liberal or other politician who voted for these new draconian laws, because what they're doing is suppressing the public's right to be involved in peaceful protest, and at the same time engendering the idea of other people, oh, that's not going to work. We'll take action into our own hands. So I hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, I'll hold the governments that pass this draconian anti-peaceful protest laws to blame.
Yeah, it's challenging times we're in, that's for sure. Yeah, and one of the things that I think, again, was so powerful about the Franklin was how you got the whole nation involved in this campaign to save the Franklin River. Like the Franklin campaign was kind of a focal point, I guess, of a more national campaign to save forest and wilderness places. And this is a photo of one of the rallies in Melbourne. What role did that national, backing and what role did that national support play in the campaign?
Alexa, totally important.
Yeah.
We couldn't win in Tasmania locally, and I think there have to be echoes of this in the Hunter Valley. Locally, you're in a hostile environment because the populace has been told about cheaper power. I'm talking about the Franklin Dam now, more jobs, more industry coming to the state, etc., etc. It all turned out to be wrong. And later on, the Hydroelectric Commission admitted that their figures were wrong. The Wilderness Society had been right and the dam wasn't warranted. But at the time, we had all three newspapers in Tasmania in favour of the dam, both the Labor and Liberal Party, both houses of Parliament, the unions, except for the Electrical Trades Union, and the churches were silent by and large. So it didn't look like there was anywhere to go. And we had marches in all the main cities on the mainland and other places like, again, Armidale in New South Wales and Bendigo in Tasmania. And these were very, very important. Firstly, they fed back a real feeling of we're galvanising, we got support across the country. But secondly, they affected the politicians, the majority of politicians. And when it came to the crunch, Labor was happy to lose every seat in Tasmania, all 5 of them, in return for winning 20 seats, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney and Canberra, because people changed their vote on the basis of this big environmental issue. And of course, you can see in the middle of that platypus's rights. It was made by folk in Melbourne. It took them, it was just an engineering wonder. And all those banners, a huge amount of work there. And we found that it took at least a month, but preferably 2 or 3 months to organise a rally that size and to hold it when kids could come, as well as we didn't allow children to go up to the blockade site because it was too dangerous. But in the rallies and places like that, of course, the more the merrier.
Yeah. And so that kind of, I guess, brings us towards the end of the campaign, after 7 years of campaigning. I think there were 3 elections and a high court case, which in the end saved the Franklin. How did it feel when you heard the news that the Franklin was saved?
Terrific. And we went to Brisbane for the High Court case. So most campaigners were in Hobart waiting by the radio, and the blockaders who were left were downriver. A little group
so
isolated.
They were still blockading,
They were still there. Wow. And they had a radio and they were all listening. We knew the court case the findings were going to be handed down at 11 o'clock. And so it did. And there we, by 4 judges to 3, the vote went in favour of the dam being stopped because the federal government had the power. And the journalist outside asked me to shake up a champagne bottle and I wouldn't. because I knew the workers and the people who were thinking the dam was great for Tasmania were going to be very angry about this outcome, and that would simply have fostered and even there's gloating going on. So we celebrated quietly. But on the way back, I'll just be very quick. On the way back from Brisbane, we flew to Sydney, and the hosties brought us a little champagne. But at Sydney, there were 100 people at the airport with their banners who'd come in to meet the plane before we got on the next one. And there was a woman from Blacktown and Western Sydney, where I'd gone to high school many years earlier. And she said, "Bob, I was doing my ironing at 11 o'clock today, and I heard people screaming in the flat next door. And I started screaming too. I didn't call the police. We put out a record, let the Franklin flow, and all danced." And this sense of joy there was all around the place, and certainly when we got back to Tasmania. So it's very important, even when the victories are small, that we celebrate them. Because the odds are daunting, but it's very important that when you do get a breakthrough, you take time out and celebrate it and have a good time.
Yeah, wow, it just makes me smile so much hearing the stories of that and just thinking about what's possible. And yeah, we've had some amazing wins, like the win today about NAB not continuing to fund Whitehaven, and yes. It was a few weeks ago that Victoria outlawed native logging as well, which was another massive win. So they do happen.
Yes, they do. And they're going to come faster, but they're going to be, of course, and that's what tonight's about, they're going to be dependent on a much more active populace. Just being on side's not good enough. You've got to take action.
Yeah, and that is a perfect segue into now. I wanted to bring us to the present, in 2023, which is almost exactly 40 years on from the Franklin campaign. And, that was just such an inspiring case study about how social movements can win. And a little bit of my story is that when I was 15, I was already struggling with some pretty intense feelings of, anxiety and rage around the climate crisis. And so I poured a lot of that energy into the school strike movement, which was at its peak at the time. And there was this moment in 2019 when I was giving a speech at one of the biggest strikes. And I still remember so vividly when I stood up on that stage, I couldn't see the edge of the crowd, and it brought me to tears seeing it. Like, I felt so elated and proud. And I think in that moment, I kind of got a taste of what social movement energy can feel like and how electric and, empowering it is. But then a few days later, I was back at school, and one of my favorite teachers asked me, she was like, "How did the strike go?" And I just burst into tears, because I felt like everything that I'd put into it, I'd been working so hard for months, and we'd pulled off something incredible. But then I guess, the world just carries on as it does. And emissions just kept going up. And I think looking back now with my experience as an organizer with Rising Tide, and also after learning from some incredible campaigns like the Franklin and like yourself, Bob, I think one of the reasons why I felt like that was because we didn't have as clear of a long-term strategy to win. It kind of, a lot of it came down to that one event, which was very powerful, but we just weren't quite able to keep building the movement until we actually won. And I guess that's one of the things I like about Rising Tide. Like, we have a clear demand that's specific and achievable of shutting down the world's largest coal port by 2030. And that's why we ask you here tonight, so that we can draw on the wisdom of historically successful campaigns like the Franklin, so that we can do it again and build a mass movement here in 2023. Like, we're trying to build a landmark struggle in Newcastle, like you did with the Franklin. And we know that we need a national movement behind us, and that we also need a really strong political strategy. And, like you said, Labor or Liberals aren't going to save us. So all that's to say, basically, we're trying to do what you did. We're trying to build a massive, powerful movement that can actually win. And I know that it's a massive question, but what's your advice? Where do we start?
Well, Look, those massive school strike or climate are embedded in the mind of
They were
everybody.
amazing. Yeah.
And that means every current politician, they're a big factor, for example, in the growing vote for the Teals and the Greens. And the fact that at the last federal election, 70% of people voted for pro-coal and pro-logging companies, but 30% didn't.
Yeah.
And for the first time, and I just know this statistics because of where I'm from, but for the first time, more under 24-year-olds voted for the Greens than voted for the mega coalition parties.
Wow.
The national. And the latest news poll from the Murdoch media show that there are now more intending to vote for Greens, and I think that probably includes the Teals,
Yeah.
than are going to vote for coalition or national party under 35. The demographics moving, and that's because people know that there is this wide movement, that there are millions of others feeling the same way. But you're also quite right. You need to have a defined target that you can work for and hone in on that and go for it. And that's why I think Rising Tide's really very impressive. And it knows where it's going. It knows what it's wanted. It's a big ask, as was stopping the biggest hydro dam in the Southern Hemisphere was a big ask back in 1983. And it is based on people getting active. And so I think it's very impressive what Rising Tide is doing. And I think it's also really important that you have got people in Sydney, hopefully a Rising Tide group there, people elsewhere.
And we've nearly got one in Adelaide too. That's exciting.
Yes, well, see, Adelaide, 6,000 people turned out for the Franklin Dam at a march, and we can go back to that. I'll tell you why, because as we know, looking at this last week, the heat figures in the Northern Hemisphere, but also here in Tasmania, it's everywhere, it's just mild beyond belief. Where is the snow? Where is the frost? It's very, very limited. So it is worrying people, and they're going to get going, and giving them a specific goal, as you are doing, that's to end coal exports out of Newcastle, is a terrific and definitive thing that people can get involved with. And, environment, employment, education, ecology, environment, employment and education. And that education is a joust between we, the people, and them, the mine owners, and that includes Whitehaven, of course, and all the big gas frackers and Woodsides of the world and so on, have a huge complementary commercial arrangement with much of the media. And so we're up against it there, but there's ways of breaking in through that. And ultimately, they don't rule the roost. What the people are thinking rules the roost in a democracy. So I think that the campaign, Rising Tides campaign, you've already shown how you can capture national and international coverage. And I think it's just fantastic that you're aiming to go bigger. Wow.
Yeah, for sure.
Impressive and exciting.
We've only just started.
That's terrific, because there's so much at stake. It is so serious, but it is it's the David and Goliath thing, isn't it? And you've got the slingshot.
Yes. Yeah. What's your political analysis of the situation that we find ourselves in with you mentioned a bit before about Labor and Liberal bringing in these new protest laws, and even though we have a Labor government at the moment, really they're not doing anywhere near enough. What's your take?
Well, that's exactly right. And those laws are being brought in internationally. Most states in the US have got vilification, laws to criminalise environmentalists. Boris Johnson's laws, which he brought in Britain to against Extinction Rebellion and Stop Oil, etc., have got some key words in them that are the same as the legislation brought in New South Wales and Tasmania and so on. And what's behind that is the corporations who've got barristers at will, and it's all tax deductible to them, writing the legislation and handing it to spineless politicians who put it through the parliament. And then, and as we know, there's this arrangement whereby in return, the politicians in the big parties at least say, well, we won't tread on the toes of the big media and we won't tread on the toes of our big funders. So it's going to be one or other. And you'll see very often Labor and the Liberals get together to pass legislation that's in the interest of the big backers. You see that there's only one thing that they'll get together to do faster than that, and that's to raise parliamentary salaries, and very, very quickly. But it won't come because of, you can forget the Liberal and National parties, except, as I said earlier, it's very important to go and see them and to talk to them. And there'll always be some good-hearted people in there, but I suspect most of those who would have been good-hearted people had they been not eliminated beforehand are now Teals and Teal supporters. But with Labor, there will be people in that camp, and there are people in that camp who want to change things, but they're minority, they're small, and they're nowhere near the levers of power. And the fact that this Labor government ticked off on the Scarborough, giant Scarborough Woodside gas venture in Western Australia in their first week in office said it all. So, but they've got to be, they are worried about seats at the next election. They don't want to be in combination with people who are going to take real climate action. And so it's the one thing that'll worry them more. The Minister for the Environment, Graham Richardson, who was really looking at the politics of it for the Labor Party back in the 80s, said to me, we were wanting him to do something, but I can't hear the crowd roar. He wanted people on the streets if he was going to do something. And I've never forgotten that, because that was he was in politics, the power of politics. We were there to save the environment. But when they hear the crowd roar, they will tend to take or know that they need to take action. So, we are in a democracy. The decisions are made in Sydney and in Canberra on what's going to happen in the Hunter Valley, as well as in the boardrooms. Hearing that news about the bank saying it won't fund Whitehaven anymore is a tribute to a lot of work, but it's a great move. And there's also people in those banks, of course, who don't like what's going on. And the tide is with us. It's not with them. And that's why you've got such a good name there. It is a rising tide, and it's going to keep going. And either they'll change, and I'm talking here about Labor because I can't see the Liberal and National coalition doing it, or they'll be replaced. And that's their job to work out which of those they're going to accept. But the job with us and with what you're doing is to take direct action to draw, to make sure that people can't just dismiss what's going as peripheral. And direct action does that. It always has done it. It's done it for the suffragettes. It did it for people who abolished slavery, and it will do it for climate like nothing else can.
Yeah. And we've just got to make the crowd roar, don't we? And then change will come. I love that saying a lot. So yeah, one of my, we've been talking a lot about hope this evening, and, about wins, and that is, so hopeful for me to hear. And I do think I am naturally quite an optimistic person. But at the same time, I think, sometimes it's really hard to keep that optimism in, just the deepening crisis we're in, like you mentioned, 4 of the hottest days on record have all happened in the last 2 weeks, and we're just seeing rolling climate disasters around the world. And for me, one of the first times when I think that really sunk in, the reality of it all, was that Black Summer bushfires. We all felt it. Our country was on fire, and it was really scary. And I guess I'm really afraid that that's what almost every summer is going to look like for the rest of my life. And that we're hurling towards a cliff with our foot still on the accelerator. It's scary, and I feel, I guess, let down that this is the world that my generation has inherited. And that's why I guess I'm fighting, because I feel like I have everything at stake. It's my whole life, it's my whole future, and my generation's future. And I think fighting is the only way that I can remain hopeful. But it's also just not dependent on me fighting, but it's also dependent, as on so many other people stepping up and kind of reprioritizing their lives in the way that you've done and shown that can be done. So I wanted to ask you about a quote that really resonated with me when I watched the film The Giants. And you said, defiance is defying the impulse to think it's all too much. So how do you remain defiant?
Well, it's very important to look after yourself. And Emma Goldman was a social revolutionary in Chicago over 100 years ago, helping to get women out of sweatshops. Back then, the garment industry was very big, not in Bangladesh, but in Chicago. But she stopped in the middle of all that and said to her fellow socialists, as they were, I don't want your revolution if I can't dance. And it's such a great statement, because it is very easy to get involved in a movement which is taking time and changing, and climate action is and will. You just mentioned, Alexa, about it taking your lifetime. It's certainly going to see me out. And it's very important to know that. And that therefore means that you have a right to finish your degree or your certificate, or to set up that business, or to do the arts course, or to go to the entertainment, or to have a party, or to find a good companion, and even to travel in whichever way you feel most comfortable, and to wherever you feel you are most easy in going. This looking after oneself and looks after the people around, and keeps your psyche in a much better place, because you do have to work at being optimistic. That statement by Bertrand Russell, who led the great Aldermaston marches against nuclear weapons in the middle of last century near London, is the trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure, but the intelligent are full of self-doubt. And, the thing to the intelligent is, we'll get over it. And if you are angry and don't do something about it, and certainly if you damp it down, you'll get depressed. Don't do that. If you're angry, take action. And it's much more rewarding. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to be the first person to sit on a train line. You don't have to be the person who's, carted off to jail first. You've got to find your own level and take your time, and there will be time, and to build into it. And that's why I again love what Rising Tide is doing, because it's offering so many options for those of us who do want to be active about changing the climate. And the pivotal message of ending coal exports out of Newcastle is global.
Yeah, totally.
One of the
Yeah, it
good- one-
accounts to 1% of global emissions are exported through the Newcastle coal port. So,
yeah, and if it gets stopped,
Mm.
and you know, the arguments will be, oh well, somebody else will do it. The old goes right back to the Franklin, that argument. If we don't bring industry here, they'll go somewhere else. But it's such a telling thing. If Newcastle puts an end to it, it will give people in a whole range of other places who are involved with the exploitation of nature towards to the detriment of overall humanity, to take heart in what they're doing. And the great thing about it is there's people like you, Alexa, and at the other end of the spectrum of age, me, all around the world. And one thing I have learned from traveling the world, and I've done my dash there, is that whether you're in Kenya or Guatemala or Canada or Japan, there's people just like us thinking about doing just the same things for just the same reasons. That it's very heartening to me to know that. And of course, we're in Australia, in arguably the wealthiest per capita country on the planet, if you take resources into account.
Yeah.
And we have got a democracy, and we have got guarantees of freedom, which other people can only dream about, and watchdogs on that. So our excuses for not getting active are much less than they are anywhere else, and our opportunities for taking action are much better than anywhere else.
Yeah, yes. So well I said, we have a responsibility and we also have the opportunities to get active. And in a minute, we are going to get to some questions from our audience. So this is your final reminder to put a question in the chat. By the looks of it, we've been getting a lot of questions, so I don't think we'll get through them all, unfortunately. But before we get to the Q&A, I did just want to segue a little bit into Rising Tides campaign. And, you know, one of the key elements of that is our climate defence pledge. And we are aiming to get 10,000 people to take this pledge, to commit to joining or supporting our movement of aiming to stop all coal exports by 2030. And as Bob just mentioned, you know, there are so many different ways of getting involved in this campaign. You know, when we look at the Franklin, there were over 1,000 people who got arrested, but there were thousands and thousands of others who were, you know, training and promoting and being creative. And, you know, there were so many different roles, and all of those contributions were so important. So this is the pledge. The pledge is: I pledge to be one of 10,000 plus participants in the Rising Tide climate defence movement by engaging in sustained, non-violent civil disobedience or supporting others who do. I commit to help end Australia's biggest contribution to the climate crisis and stop the export of coal via Newcastle, the world's largest coal port. So we are so happy that, Bob, you are going to be taking the pledge tonight. Can you just tell us why are you taking it?
Well, because I want to be with those 10,000 people. I don't want to be left out. And it's and you know, in there, it's non-violent. Yeah. It's there's civil disobedience there, but as a wonderful Indian journalist, standing against the appalling things happening to people in India who are trying to protect their forests against coal mining, and that's not least by the Adani Group, said quite recently, our problem isn't civil disobedience, our problem is civil obedience. Yeah. Now, people have a choice. You can be obedient when the law is wrong, or you can be disobedient to make the law right. And there's a choice here between the laws of nature, looking after this biosphere that we all depend upon and that our children in the future will depend upon, or letting it go down the sink because they've brought in so-called draconian anti-environmental laws. I want to be with the laws of nature. I want to be with the rising tide of people who are going to make this planet safer and more secure and beautiful for future generations and for our fellow creatures on this planet. And so it'll be my honour to take that pledge. And thank you for giving me that opportunity, Alexa, and everybody at Rising Tide.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. So we just want to give people just a couple of minutes really quickly now to jump on and take our pledge. So you should be able to see that we've got a QR code on the screen and a link. We're also sharing that link in the chat. We're up to 377 and our next milestone is 500. And yeah, we are really looking for as many people to take the pledge as possible. We heard Bob say it. You can, if you go to our website there or the QR code, it'll just ask for a few details that you can fill in. I think there's many people here tonight who have already signed the pledge, taken the pledge, and we're really hoping to keep going up on that. So we'd love to see people taking the pledge. So the other thing that we are doing, as we're continuing to build our movement, is we are having events, obviously. So our next massive event is going to be a blockade of the Newcastle Coal Port in November of this year. So it is happening on the 25th and 26th of November. Newcastle has a really strong tradition of having flotillas where we are putting, we're all out on our kayaks, blockading the coal ships from coming in. And so this is going to be the 12th one of those, but this time for the first time ever, it's going to be over 2 days. And we're having an extra day on the Friday and the Monday. Oh, look at that jump up. So many people taking the pledge. Amazing. So it's a 2-day blockade in November, and we're expecting that it will be the biggest one ever. We're aiming for 3,000 people. We've already got a bus is booked in from Adelaide coming, and there's groups all around the rest of the country who are sending convoys of people. So we'll send some info about that, but we're really looking forward to it. We've already got some speakers and some musicians locked in. There'll be kayaks for everyone, and it'll be, as Bob Brown said, you've got to dance during the revolution, so it will be very family friendly. Yay, we just hit 400. Woo. That's very exciting to see. Amazing. Keep them coming in all evening. So anyway, that's the blockade. It's happening in November, and it's going to be massive. It's going to be amazing. So you won't want to miss it. So I think we should get into some Q&A from the audience. And again, apologies to those who didn't get their question up tonight, but the first one is from Tom. You referred to the way people on the Franklin blockade looked after each other, as well as participating in affinity groups. How important is social capacity and cohesion in both past and present campaigns?
Tom, it's very, very important. We're really, and as I was alluding to a while ago, we're a family spread right around this planet of people who feel the same way. And that is that we have an obligation to our grandkids and their grandkids and to our fellow creatures. It's as simple as that. But the going does get tough in campaigning if it's going to be effective. I mean, it's that's just the way it is. And that means being able to look after each other. And there's nothing like being in a stressful situation with people you know and who you've had time chatting with, spent time with, that you feel comfortable with, and who are going to look after you and you'll look after them. And that's why I think the idea of affinity groups right back then was, a lot of people didn't like it, but it was a very, very good one. So I think, yes, caring for each other and knowing that people care for us makes us just so much stronger when the day comes that we're going to take direct action.
Yeah, Great. So the next one is from Angus and Harper. What was your involvement with unions and other groups during the Franklin campaign? And looking forward, what do you think the role of unions and working people is in the fight for climate justice?
Look, I think it's incredibly important. There were many more people in unions back in the Franklin days than there are now. And by and large, because politics was between Labor and Liberal, they tended to go with the Labor Party. So it wasn't until after the federal Labor Party took up the no dams position that unions could swing in behind it. But there was a politician in Cunningham, the seat in Wollongong, called Stuart West. And Stuart came from a long line of unionists, and he saw how important it was that the Franklin be saved. And he was an early mover in the Labor Party and with the unions to just point out the reasonableness of what was happening and the problems that would come if it didn't happen. I mean, if the dam had been built, we ended up with a highly automated system and 32 jobs. Now, and people know that at the end of a coal mine, you've got to find something else to do. People also know that global warming is now impacting, it's robbing jobs, and it's going to cost our grandkids somewhere around 20% of their income on current, just to deal with mitigation on current projections. Although everybody who's ever paid an insurance fee in the last 12 months compared with what's before will know that insurance is going up rapidly because of climate change and because of the failure to take action. It's taking money out of people's pockets already. So I think there's a very good story to be telling to workers there. It's very important to talk to the union bosses. They speak to corporate bosses all the time. Don't underestimate that connection. And so getting to, but there's, being a unionist is a proud and wonderful thing to do, to be standing up for working people and people who are having a struggle in life. And so it's very important to not allow them just to have their contact with the corporate people, but to be talking with the wider community. So going to see unions, joining a union, becoming active within a union is a really positive thing to do.
Yeah, very, very important. So we have a little update on the Climate Defence Pledge. We are now up to 447. So what a great jump. What do you reckon? Can we get it to 500 tonight? Wouldn't that be amazing? Keep them coming in. So our next question is from Mel. People who know of my arrest from the recent train protest, which we've mentioned, often approach the subject with a sense of humour and an air of flippancy. They seem to be more interested in the law-breaking aspects of my action and not around the motivation. Do you have any advice on how I can use these opportunities to have serious and respectful conversations with disengaged colleagues and friends that won't drive them further away from the cause?
A very good question, Mel. I always remember coming back from the Franklin after spending Christmas in jail and being asked by a relative, what's it like to be a criminal, Bob? And we're brought up to respect the law because it does keep the societies cohesive. But climate change and exporting coal is the exact opposite. It's about wrecking society and taking away its future. So I think having a very simple line to give to, I think if people are not going to engage in a serious conversation, they're not. Wait until you get somebody who does want to. But you just should always ask a question. When you talk to a politician, always end with a question, but with friends, the same. And at the end of it, would you like to talk about why I did it? Yeah. That's a simple question. It puts them in the position of having to say yes or no to that. And you can take it as they answer. Just say, I was very serious to me. I am concerned about everybody and this beautiful planet of ours. What would you do and would you like to talk about why I did it? And they'll find themselves having to think very seriously then about what you've so nobly done.
Yeah, those chats, they're hard, but so important. So our next one is from Tom. Hi, Bob. You said in The Giants that the key to success of the Franklin campaign was direct action on the ground and a court case. Is there a parallel now with stopping coal exports?
Oh, exactly. That's why Rising Tide and other groups that are taking direct action around the world against oil, coal, gas, and logging and burning of forests are so critically important. And what they want, and you hear this in the parliamentary debates about these new laws to criminalise environmentalists, they want us to stand with our placards on the side of the street while the coal trucks or coal trains go by. In other words,
oh, sorry, that was exactly what the magistrate said to the 50 people who got arrested at the train action. The magistrate said you could have just made your point by standing with your placards on the other side of the train tracks.
Yes, well, you see, in some ways that's a reasonable comment from the magistrate, but really it's highly political, and that's politicising the court. He or she had no right to make such a statement, and he or she had no right to say that you should have stood ineffectively to the side, because that's what it is. In other words, I'm judging you here on the fact that you are effective, and I'm going to penalise you for being effective. And you know, when we did go to the High Court over the first round of environmental laws to criminalise environmentalists, the High Court threw out those laws because they went across the implied right in our Australian Constitution in a representative democracy of people to take peaceful direct action. It's there implied in the Constitution. And of course, since then, all the states' lawyers have been getting their head around how do we get the laws around that implied right. It will be tested again in the courts. But at the end, I've seen a number of judgments recently where environmental activists have had comments coming from magistrates which are of themselves a real affront to the idea that justice is for everybody and will be balanced. Their opinions have no right in a court, and I'm sure the magistrate who made that statement was good-hearted and so on, but she or he had not thought out that standing on the footpath to make a point is allowing the planet to go down the chute.
Yeah, totally. So we have a question now from Tristan. Where do you see the climate movement in 20 years?
I'm not very good at prognostications. I said after the Franklin win that a new age of environmentalism was coming. Well, in a way it has, because people know much more about it, but the corporate sector simply saw it as a signal to get the public relations machines and their lobbying machines and, of course, their ability to get weak-spined politicians to pass legislation to help protect them into action. And so things got worse, not better. In 20 years' time, if we don't have governments which are doing the job that Rising Tide is doing now and banning the export of fossil fuels, indeed banning new coal mines, gas fracking and forest logging and so on, there will be a much more disturbed and disrupted populace, because we are thoughtful, we are mammals that know we're the biggest herd grazing on the planet and we're overdoing it, and we've got to pull our socks up, or we've got to pull our belt in, more importantly. And this whole conversation tonight is because we're not prepared to allow that to happen. We're the tip of the iceberg. So if there hasn't been much more radical change than we're seeing the big party politicians willing to undertake, or the corporates at the moment, there's going to be mayhem. And watch the rise. Look at the longer history of the suffragettes before they got to the point of huge downtown demonstrations, which were pretty ugly and undignified, if you ask me. And you'll see that because climate affects everybody, and it's urgent and it's now, it's going to be unprecedented. There's going to be an unprecedented civil disruption if our politicians allow it to happen. It's not us who's going to cause it to happen, it's them and the media and the vested interests that are not prepared to insist on change, and rapid change now, to save the planet.
Yeah, you're totally right. And we've got time for one final question from Kathy Howard and a few others. So it is, there must have been hard days during the Franklin campaign. What advice can you share to assist activists in managing these darker days and maintaining their optimism?
Yeah, take time out. You can get caught into campaigning where you just simply can't go away for a break because there's so much on, or there might be, a media event, or letters to be written, or a parliamentary session coming up, or a new shipment of coal, or a new mine opening, on and on it goes.
Yeah.
Take time out, plan it ahead and take it. Make sure you do it. And of course, the other thing is to give time for your social life, family, friends, new companions. And as I said earlier, the time to move around. I got grabbed by the collar by the most highly decorated American Marine in the Vietnam War, which, as you'll know, was a pretty nasty affair in Hobart. And he said, "You've got to stop lobbying and campaigning on forests. Ronald Reagan's become the president of the United States. He's mad. He's going to, he's capable of unleashing nuclear weapons." And it suddenly struck me. I said to him, "David, if that's the case, I'm going home to read a book." Don't get overtaken by the anxiety of it all. I mean, and you have to put some of the really pressing issues on the shelf while you get on, like with the upcoming hopeful 3,000 people in Newcastle. There's a goal, there's a defined goal, go for that. And train your brain to be able to accept that we do what we can, and we're the better if we're happy individuals, if we've got a component of collectedness, of fulfillment, of a feeling of a well-being, about being somehow the lottery winners. We're the human beings alive on this planet in 2023. Others before us didn't have this opportunity. Others after us won't. We're the ones that can make the change. It's a great privilege, and we should feel good about it. But when the going gets tough, look after yourself and make sure you go to those people who'll put an arm around your shoulder and say, "Hey, glad you're here. Let's have a good time together."
Great advice, and your optimism is very inspirational for all of us. So we tried to choose questions that kind of related to campaigning and VDA experiences. Thanks for all of the questions, and they were recorded, as this event has also been fully recorded. There were also some questions for Rising Tide and about our campaign, and there'll be a chance for you to ask those ones at our very first National Welcome Night, which will be another online Zoom on the 31st of July. So check that out if you have more questions about our campaign. So in a minute, I'm just going to throw back to Shawnee, and we're going to have a chance to get into some breakout groups in cities, because we've got people, as we've mentioned, from all across the country. So we'll give you a chance to connect with some of those people. But before then, I just wanted to say again, massive thank you so much, Bob, for joining us tonight. It's been incredible having the chance to talk with you. So we're going to unmute everyone, and everyone, let's give Bob a massive virtual round of applause.
Thanks, Alexa. Look, thanks everybody too.
Bob.
Hello, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Well done.
Looks
All
like you
right.
might need to unmute yourself again, Bob. Sorry, you've been muted.
Can you do it? He can't do it.
I got it. I was just saying, look, the thing, you're inspiring me at 78 or 9, whatever I am. I feel just good connecting with people like you. You're the hope of the future. Look, just terrific, and all strength. You're really fantastic people. I wish you every success.
Thank you. Means a lot.
Thanks so much, Bob. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks to Alexa for that wonderful interview. Very insightful and inspiring. You've also heard that we're planning a huge blockade of the Newcastle coal port in late November as a way of building momentum for the blockade. We're doing a national speaking tour to a number of cities: Lismore, Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney. And in each city in that speaking tour, we're doing a public forum with Alexa plus other keynote speakers. And I'm also going to be running a strategy training alongside after each forum at a different time. So in a minute, we're going to open up breakout rooms for each of those cities so that you have an opportunity to connect with other people who are involved in organising in those places. And we'll also open up a breakout room if you're in another location, but you're keen to get active in organising or promoting the blockade. So if you don't live in one of those places or don't want to join the breakout, then no worries. Thanks very much for coming and feel free to jump off. But otherwise,